It's been quite a week at Temple since last Shabbat, with a wedding on Sunday, a baby naming after the wedding, and 4 funerals from Sunday through yesterday. The circle of life never stops at Temple Israel. And that's a fitting description of where we are this week in the Torah, in the final episode of a story you likely know from the Broadway show Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. The final scene is where everything comes together as Joseph and his brothers make up. They reconcile. It happens after Judah, the namesake of the Jewish people, stands up and protests the way the other brothers have been treated without Judah and the other brothers even knowing that they are facing the same younger brother, Joseph, whom they once wronged when they were young and threw into a pit. Joseph, who is now like vice president of Egypt in a powerful position, he breaks down, he falls apart, and in one of the most emotional scenes in all of Scripture, Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers after all these years. At first, they cannot believe that it is really him. They thought that he was a slave or that he was dead since they threw him into a pit. But Joseph is very much alive, and he's grown up to be a decent person. He invites his brothers to settle in an area of Egypt named Goshen, and he even sends for their elderly father, Jacob, so that the family can be reunited. The big idea, in one word: forgiveness. Forgiveness. It's been suggested that when Joseph forgives his brothers this week in the Torah, he invents the very idea of forgiveness because no one in the Bible had ever done that before this week in the Torah. For families, communities, for friends to exist, there has to be a way that people can forgive and be forgiven. Joseph learns to forgive when he comes to realize in his own life cycle that what happened in his earlier years was hard to see back then. But now he realizes it was part of a bigger plan. That what he saw about his life at age 17 was not the whole story. Now older, Joseph realizes a larger frame behind the different ages and stages of his life. And what enables Joseph to forgive is the understanding that while you and I and Joseph may live our lives in the present, it's the past that created us, and it is we who shape the future. We learn from Joseph in the Torah that there really are no endings or beginnings, just continuations. We live in the present and we live with the past. But whether it's a synagogue like ours, a basketball or football team like the Tigers or Grizzlies, or any of your families, we're all links in a chain, including this synagogue, which was founded 7 years before the Civil War in 1854 in downtown Memphis. And God willing, will live on strong 7 generations from now, not 7 weeks from now. At my own family gathering 3 days ago in California, the presence of a key relative who died in recent years was missing. We didn't go to a party. We just had 16 relatives in one big room on New Year's Eve. But the key relative was not there. And I shared with my other relatives that at every family celebration, whether it's a birthday or New Year's or another holiday, there's always a chair at the table that's empty. You know, a seat for that patriarch or matriarch or child or aunt or uncle or other relative or close friend who was always there at these celebrations. The chair may be empty, but as I told my aunt, he's still seated among us, present to us, and alive through us, because his presence is still so deeply felt across all the generations. The chair is empty, but when a special relative of yours has merited a place in your heart forever, then you begin to understand what Joseph did. There really are no beginnings or endings, just continuations. When we gathered last Friday night together for Shabbat, it was 2019. Tonight, it's 2020. But nothing has ended, just the timeless wisdom of Torah extended. On this first Shabbat of the New English year 2020, as we create new memories in the year ahead, I want to close with one more idea emanating from this week's Torah portion, Vayigash, and I hope it remains with you through December. And that idea that we learned this week is to remember the good and not only the bad. Sounds simple. Remember the good and not only the bad. It's human nature to only remember the bad. Or if you've ever studied psychology, psychologists show a circle with a part broken, and people in this study focus on the broken part of the circle rather than the 99% of the circle where there isn't a break. It's human nature to dwell on the bad. Sometimes we Jews fall into only remembering the bad. Like when we think of Egypt, we often think of slavery, despair. But the story this week of Joseph reminds us that Egypt was actually a very welcoming place to our people. Did you know the Hebrew word for Egypt, Mitzrayim, occurs more than 700 times in the Bible? Only the name Israel occurs more frequently, and there is not a single derogatory reference to the Egyptians. True, we were warned to stay away from bad practices exercised by some people in the land. I hope we tell all our kids and parents to stay away from some of the bad practices people do everywhere. But with equal sternness, this is what the Torah says. You shall not despise the Egyptians, because remember that you were once a sojourner in their land, and they gave you refuge in their land and made you feel welcome. So it's not only about seeing the positive or staying positive. We learned this week that while the comedian jokes about the Jewish memo, you know the Jewish memo? Worry now, details to follow. We learned this week that that really is a joke, because remembering the good is the lesson of this week's Parsha. because remembering the good shapes who we are and what we become individually and as a people. Ken Yehi Ratzon, so may it be every day this year. And let us say, Amen.